When American voters gave President-elect Donald Trump his decisive victory this month, they made clear they want change in Washington. And with the announcement of his cabinet picks, Trump is making clear that the status quo is not in his plans. That's a welcome message in a nation that just hit $36 trillion in debt, a figure that is rising by $1 trillion every 100 days.
It is time to transform this country, because if we don't do it now, we're going to lose it. If we don't constrain spending now, if we don't set the trajectory of lower debt now, we will not have a dollar, we will not have a strong economy.
That was Texas Congressman Chip Roy last week on the House floor. So, how might the incoming Trump administration deal with the nation's fiscal nightmare? Joining me now to discuss this is Paige Hauser, Policy Director at the Center for Renewing America. She previously served as Associate Director for Domestic Policy in the first Trump administration and a Special Assistant at the Department of Education in the Office of Post-Secondary Education. Paige, welcome to Washington Watch.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, you heard Congressman Roy's comments there. In your opinion, just how serious is America's debt problem?
I mean, $36 trillion, that's more money than I think anybody's ever heard of. The numbers are staggering, so it could not be more serious. As Congressman Roy articulated there, we are on the precipice. We like to say at Center for Renewing America that the hour is 11:59 and time is of the essence. So the massive victory of President Trump on Election Day could not come at a better time.
So how would you describe the difference in the economic policy of the upcoming Trump administration, or at least what we expect, compared to what we've seen from the Biden administration over the last 4 years?
Well, I think it's an important question, and I think it's one of the huge reasons why President Trump won. You can feel it in your everyday life. You go to the grocery store, things are more expensive than they've ever been. Rent is expensive. People are finding it difficult to buy a house, start a family. That is all part and parcel to the Biden economic agenda. We had their Inflation Reduction Act, which did the opposite. It created more inflation. They've got more spending than we have ever had historically in the country. And all of that makes everything more expensive for Americans. And you couple the economic policy, which makes everything more expensive, with the lack of border security. And we have an invasion across our southern border with millions upon millions of illegal immigrants coming into the country. That creates job problems. That creates housing problems. It creates strains on our school systems and our healthcare systems. All of that, the American people see every single day, and they said they've had enough, and that's why I think President Trump won.
Now, I think you're right. I think there's a discontent with what has been over the last several years. But when it comes to this $36 trillion debt problem we have, this has been created by bipartisan forces. And we know that President Trump was president before, and he wasn't exactly a slash and cut spending kind of president the first time. And just to go over some of the numbers, in 2017, he had a $665 billion deficit. In 2018, it was a $779 billion deficit. In 2019, it was a $984 billion deficit. Now, that's all before COVID, and we know that was an unusual situation, which certainly led to additional government spending. In light of this history, and even in light of kind of how he campaigned, and he wasn't campaigning as a guy who's going to dramatically cut government spending necessarily, what do you expect in light of how he has conducted himself as president in the past? Is he actually going to cut spending?
Yeah, I think you make a good point calling it a bipartisan problem, because everyone knows that the way that spending works for the federal government is Congress passes their appropriations bills. Usually it's not the 12 annual appropriations bills, but it's all one big one jammed together, usually at the end of the year, right before Christmas time, and they force a situation where it's sign the bill or shut the federal government down, and usually a bill gets signed. I will say that President Trump, when he was in office, put forth a balanced budget every time the president proposes a budget, and then Congress usually disposes of that budget, and they pass their own spending bills, and on we go. $36 trillion later, I do think that you will see more from President Trump of balanced budgets. My boss, Russ Vought, has been tapped to go back to the Office of Management and Budget. I think he will take with him the same idea that we put forward at CRA, a budget that balanced in 10 years. It cut trillions of dollars in discretionary federal spending. And then I think you will see that. And then I think the pressure is also going to be on Congress, which will be majority Republican, to actually do something about the federal debt, and to not just look at it through the lens of what can we afford, what can we not afford, but also the fact that the federal government is woke and weaponized against the American people, that the federal spending is not just bad because we can't afford it. We've never heard of numbers like a $36 trillion, but also they are funding things with your taxpayer dollars that are absolutely against your interests. It is the DEI, it is the gender fluidity ideology that you see in public schools across the country, that there is a moral outrage over. And I think that Congress and the president will have no choice but to stop funding that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and we certainly hope they will, and there does seem to be momentum in that direction. But though I don't know the numbers, I assume the amount of money that would be saved by cutting out CRT and DEI, kind of the ideology from our federal spending, is a fraction of the $36 trillion problem that we have. Do you think the American people are really willing to accept the consequences of reducing spending in a way that will meaningfully impact that kind of a debt problem that we have? Or do we have this debt because it's what the American people are currently demanding? Are the politicians willing to tell the people the truth about this situation?
Well, you say it's a fraction of a fraction. I would just push back a little bit and say it's a huge amount of money. I mean, the Federal Department of Education is something like a $70 billion agency right now. The State Department is a $50 billion agency, and they spend that every single year, and that begins to add up to the point where you do get $36 trillion. We at the Center for Renewing America put out a budget which would balance over 10 years by just mainly cutting the discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is what we're saying is primarily woke and weaponized against the American people. It is not going after the Medicare and the Social Security, those so-called entitlement programs. We have a budget that says you can actually balance without touching Medicare and Social Security. You can actually go after and reduce the size of woke and weaponized government. You have to grow the economy. You made the difference between, or you pointed out the difference between the Biden economy and the Trump economy. You have to grow as well, but you can cut huge amounts of spending. And I do think the American people want that. I, in fact, think that they will demand it when they find out that their federal taxpayer dollars are funding critical race theory in the schools, social emotional learning, that they are doing the gender fluidity unicorns in K through 12 schools instead of actually teaching them to read and to do math. All of that is outrageous to the American people. And I think, one, as I said before, that's why President Trump won. But I also think that they will demand that their taxpayer dollars stop funding that.
Yeah. To that point, Paige, Scott Bessent has recently been nominated to be the Treasury Secretary, and he said very recently that he thinks we can grow our way out of the debt problem, which is a way of saying we can grow our economy in such a way that we have so much more revenue that we can pay down that problem. Do you agree? I mean, that's the optimistic view of this. We'd all like to think, hey, we're just going to grow. There's going to be so much more money that we don't even have to cut our spending in order to do that. Is that realistic? And is that 10-year budget you referenced that you put together part of that answer?
Yeah, I think it is part of the answer. I do not think that you can only grow. Growing is essential. It is important. I think there are other sources of revenue. We've looked at changes to the tax code that actually increase revenues into the federal treasury. If President Trump does what he has said he wants to do and raises a tariff, that will increase revenues into the federal treasury. You have to be able to grow your economy, but no, that is not enough. You must also cut spending. And I think that the president and Congress will have the moral high ground to do that cutting. It is necessary. And that is what the American people demand, especially when they hear that their money is being spent on gay pride parades in Prague and drag shows in Ecuador. That is not something that they think that their money should be spent on. DOJ has a huge responsibility in this. Raiding school boards and parents that show up at school boards and treating them as domestic terrorists, all of that costs money. All of that is being fueled and funded by federal spending. Yeah. Stop spending that, and yes, grow the economy, and we would get way closer to a balanced federal budget.
One of the controversies in Congress in recent years when it comes to spending is the process Congress goes through in order to pass budgets. And these omnibuses have become normal. Instead of considering different packages, different budgets, where members of Congress get to debate those provisions and propose amendments in a way that would perhaps lead to greater efficiency, everything is just put together in one giant bill under the pressure of, is the government going to shut down? And so everybody feels an obligation to pass it without real deliberation of the details. Do you think that's something that's going to change in the next 2 years when Republicans are in control of the White House and both houses of Congress?
Yeah, we euphemistically call them Christmas tree bills because they usually show up at the end of the year, and they are not very nice, though. They are loaded with all kinds of bad spending that, of course, if anybody knew or if it was broadcast what was in the bills, they would never pass. And as you say, they don't read them anyways, and they just go on business as usual. I think there will be enormous pressure to stop doing that. You heard Congressman Roy at the beginning of the segment. They cannot keep doing this, and they do not have the excuse anymore of saying, "Oh well, we're in divided government. We just have to do this, or else the federal government will shut down." No, you have a Republican-controlled House, a Republican-controlled Senate, and you will have the presidency. We do have a spending fight coming up at the end of this year before all of that change takes place. There will be pressure to do a Christmas tree, but I think that can be resisted, knowing that if they just do a short-term funding bill.
We are up against the deadline. I'm sorry to cut you off, but thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.